Okay, I'm going to start again, and I'm going to say that I've got the great honor of introducing Victor Olliver. And like I said, I have known Victor for quite a few years now. And he is a graduate of the Mayo School with a very high distinction. But he has also been the journal editor for nearly over 8 years now for the Astrological Association. And what an incredible job that he does. And we're so grateful for his mastery in that. He's also got a book out this year called Chasing the Dragons, an Introduction to Draconic Astrology, which is published by Wessex Astrologer. It's a great book, highly recommend it. And he also has another one coming out later this year called Astrology, Secrets of the Signs and Planets, which is published by Flame Tree. So he is based near Brighton in West Sussex, and he's going to talk to us tonight about Draconic astrology and synastry. So thank you, Victor, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy. I'm going to share my screen, if I may. Hopefully, I'll enlarge the screen. Is that okay?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Wendy. And we're talking about Draconic synastry this evening. As you see, why I married my ultimate nightmare. This is going to be the fastest lecture you've ever heard. Time's against us. I'm not going to waste too much time with a lot of padding. Let's move on immediately. Yes, oh gosh, it's that book. I'm sorry about this, I'm always advertising myself, but thank you, Wendy, for mentioning my book. And I'm not going to go through the rules of it. We're going to get cracking. Now, the thing about what is a nightmare relationship? Well, it's quite simple, really. It starts in love and lust and then evolves into war or devolves into war. And that's it, basically. We don't have to be too clever about it. The idea came to me as I watched hours and hours of it, the defamation trial between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. I want to emphasize very quickly that I'm not going to take sides in any of these pairings. I'm going to look at, if we've got time, I'm going to look at 3 pairs actually. Depp Heard, then Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas, otherwise known as Bosie, and then Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon. But I have a feeling that I may not have time to go to the 3rd couple. Now, you'll be familiar with synastry, the comparing and contrasting of natal charts to establish whether a couple are likely to get on or not, whether they're compatible, that sort of thing. And just because there are struggles indicated in the synastry chart, squares and oppositions, that doesn't mean that the relationship can't work, but it does mean that it will require a lot of work, maybe. And I think we all know from experience that relationships usually require work. I've amazingly got into my mid-60s by avoiding nightmare relationships, and basically I can see them coming. I've got sort of paranormal antennae. So I think that partly qualifies me to talk about this subject because I can see them coming, you know. You'll be familiar with synastry, maybe some of you less familiar with Draconic astrology. Now, I have to be honest and say that you're not going to learn about Draconic, the technique, today. The best that I can do is to indicate to you how it works in relation to the tropical chart. And rather than just spend time talking about the technique, I'll go through the cases and throw in some Draconic stuff. If the outcomes interest you, then I highly recommend that you learn the technique. It's very straightforward. The complication with it lies in interpretation and understanding that with the Draconic chart, you're actually dealing with a moon-based chart. And you erect it by moving the north node, which is the destiny point, and it's a lunar point. You move it from where it is in the natal chart to 0 degrees Aries. That's as much as I'm going to mention about the technique. You then shift the rest of the chart by the same number of degrees and minutes that exist between the natal north node and 0 degrees Aries. And there, in essence, you've got your Draconic chart. But that's where the work starts, because you're comparing a moon-based chart with the Draconic. And why are we doing this? Well, we're trying to find out, why did these 2 people get into this relationship? Why do we tend towards certain people that we then get stuck in a war with? What is it that we're trying to learn about ourselves? This may not be a conscious process. In fact, 99% of the time, it's not a conscious process. It is a spiritual, subconscious erring towards situations that will confront us. I mean, I was talking to Anna Isabel about this recently, and she calls them appointments with God or appointments with fate. It's as if something in our lives, we understand that there is dysfunction within ourselves, lack of balance. The fact that we get locked in some nightmare scenario may give rise to self-awareness. And what the Draconic synastry aims to do is to suggest what those themes may be that are thrown up within ourselves that we have to confront. Is it that we're power control freaks? Is it that we don't really fully commit? These are the sort of issues that arise. Now let's start with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. I don't think I have to say too much about it. It was live streamed peculiarly, I thought. Johnny Depp had asked for it to be live streamed. Amber Heard didn't want it, but there we go. And we were therefore open to an extraordinary series of revelations, from severed finger to strange objects found in the marital bed, we won't go there, to all sorts of other very strange and sometimes bizarre and shocking detail. In other words, it wasn't the happiest of relationships, and that's an understatement. It would be fair to say, I think we can say in all fairness, it was highly dysfunctional. But does that mean that it was a waste of time? Let's have a look. Now, with Draconic synastry, you start with the tropical chart. And I want to emphasize with Draconic, it's always starting with a tropical chart, because that's where you're going to get most of your information. We don't have time to fully delineate the charts. So just, if you like, sit back and kind of lap up some of the details that I'm chucking at you, because I'm trying to focus on the key details rather than immersing in micro-analysis. We're looking at Johnny Depp's tropical natal chart. We have an exact time for it, so we're pretty confident that he's Leo rising, and we find that the sun is ruling his chart in Gemini in the 11th house. I only use the equal house, but you can use any house you like. If you want to use whole signs, if you want to use Placidus, Regiomontana, it's up to you. But I find equal house works very nicely. And it's interesting that he's got Venus, Mercury, and Taurus in the 10th house. I think that's quite telling. He's got quite a powerhouse in his first house with Pluto and Mars quite close. That's quite an interesting sort of area. It gives them a powerhouse determination, but it can hint at psychological issues that need to be dealt with. And we notice too, if you look at the bottom of the chart, just quickly, that strange object between Neptune and the IC is Black Moon Lilith. And I have noticed in highly dysfunctional relationships that this point, this lunar point, Black Moon Lilith, plays a very important part. It actually represents the furthest point the moon reaches in its orbit from Earth. That's what it represents. And it's associated with isolation, but also deeply buried, fairly dysfunctional energies at a primitive level, which need to be recognized and brought to the surface. And it tends to have a very angry energy. There's a whole mythology to it, and you can read about it. So I'm not going to examine the whole chart. The only last thing I want to say about Depp's chart is that North Node, you see in the 12th house, is in Cancer. This tells me that there are major challenges to do with the emotions, the psyche, with the moon-based sort of themes that we know about. So he's coming from a fairly structured default position in his character to challenges related to the emotional area, related it specifically to the psyche, and that's further emphasized by the 12th house. Some of you may think that he's already exploring that in his destiny through his work, but I think there's more to it than that. Let's have a look at Amber Heard's chart. Oh, I should say he's got a very fixed earthy chart, but I won't go on about that. Amber Heard's chart, we don't have a time for her, so you must ignore the houses, you must ignore the points. However, I'm quite the aesthete, and I like to look at a chart that looks like that. I don't like houseless charts, so you just have to use your imagination. Forget about Aries rising. We don't know whether Aries is rising, we just don't have the time. But we do know that she has her MC, her North Node rather, in Aries. That's quite interesting. There's Venus, her Venus is actually dignified in Taurus. So it's quite interesting when we look at the Draconic chart, what that reveals. The Draconic tends to rise up issues that need to be attended to. So you'll see in a minute what I mean about that. We see the South Node in Libra is conjunct the IC in the 7th. Well, it's not in the 7th. We don't actually know where it is. But anyway, we'll have to, unfortunately, we can't know where the nodal axis sits in the chart. But it's interesting to me that it actually is in the last minute of Aries. That's a little bit dodgy, isn't it? It could easily be in Taurus. So we can't be absolutely so, but Aries is certainly involved to some extent, even if it's on the cusp. And that gives rise, therefore, to assertion, to independence, and also taking full control of her life. That's, in a sense, the tropical interpretation of her North Node. Now, what we've done here is we're looking at the tropical. I'm just going to move. I can see myself on the screen. I'm just going to move myself. We're looking at the tropical synastry chart. We can see why they're drawn to each other. Notice that the Venuses are conjunct the Marses. Yes, the plural of Marses, in my opinion. The Marses are trine, the Uranus are trine. So we can see why they're drawn to each other, but the suns are semi-square. It's a minor aspect, but it's worth bearing in mind. His sun is opposed by her Saturn-Uranus, moons are square. His moon square her Mercury, her Venus square his Mars. In other words, we're seeing quite a few problems already. With the square, there are going to be issues, rows, arguments, or things to be resolved. It doesn't always mean that the relationship is doomed, but it does show up that there are relationship, in the alliance, there are going to be discordant energies. I should point out that the Johnny Depp chart is the inner wheel and Amber Heard's is the outer wheel. What are you looking? Do notice that her Pluto, this is quite interesting, the Pluto down here, we have to be careful about houses, but with Pluto, it's actually conjunct his black moon Lilith. And this is a very powerful indication that part of her role in relation to him is actually to profoundly challenge him. Now, that's not to grant approval to anything that we may have heard in the trial or any other trials that have taken place between them. But this is a very powerful indication of very deep, powerful energies. And of course, emphasized by the fact that it's in Scorpio. And so this will tend to dig into subconscious energies and drives and all sorts of different things. There's a lot else going on in this chart. Normally, when I'm doing a delineation, I do look at the moon phase as well. We notice, for example, that Depp's full moon is in the full moon phase. So it's quite an emotional, explosive sort of character. It's interesting to see that her sun is sitting on his MC as well. That's quite interesting. There's definitely a soul connection, but it's opposite all this energy down here, Pluto and so forth. So, I mean, so even if we didn't know what went on between them, we know that this is going to be quite a challenging relationship. What we're going to do next is that we're going to convert the tropical chart into a draconic chart. Now, I said it's about shifting the North Node from its natal position to 0 degrees Aries. I can't demonstrate that now, we haven't got the time. So just go with this, look to see the outcomes. And if you're interested in the outcomes, maybe you'll be interested in exploring it further for yourself. Now, what the Draconic tends to do is that it tends to emphasize or bring to the fore themes that are touched on in the tropical, but elevates them as themes. It turns them into the headline news. So it's interesting to observe that Amber Heard's Venus now is demoted, in effect, from Taurus to Aries. And therefore, it's not in the best place. Venus doesn't like being in Aries because it throws up issues to do with independence and working jointly. That, in essence, is the problem. So this tells me, from a Draconic perspective, that relationship issues are likely to be faced in her life. It's interesting that his Venus now is moved to Aquarius, which in a sense expands his base, but it also introduces issues to do with distancing. So we cannot say in the normal astrological sense that it's in detriment or fall, but what we could say is that it gives rise to issues of distancing and of separation between mind and heart. We're talking headline news, remember, we don't have time to microanalyze. There are other interesting things going on here. Her Venus is square his black moon Lilith via Neptune, disposited by Mars and Sagittarius. This is dynamic, fiery, and confrontational. We can suppose, but we cannot say as a fact, but draconically we can suggest that her sole purpose in relation to him is to confront as a source of knowledge. It's not for us to judge the value of the confrontation or what gives rise, but there is a natural tendency here for her to confront. His Venus, as I've said, shifts to Aquarius. It squares the Saturns, which is difficult, I think. It means that there are going to be naturally imposed limits within this relationship which have to be negotiated. Uranus is opposite in Taurus, and her black moon Lilith. Again, it's quite challenging. There's strong independence complicated by a powerful need to resolve discordant subconscious energies within the relationship. Just move my box again. Her Saturn rather is conjunct his part of fortune, Saturn in Scorpio. There's a powerful relationship issue here, I think, given oppositional energies. There are powerful wills focused on inner revolutions via confrontation. That word again, confrontation. Opposite is Mars, Uranus, Pluto, and her Draco Chiron. Notice also that her Uranus is conjunct his Chiron in Scorpio. Certainly it's going to be the case that she will bring a disruptive influence into his life. We'll look in a minute as to what he's doing in her life. We will examine that. But there does seem to be, she does seem to be the very proactive part of this partnership, if I can put it that way. With Uranus conjunct her Chiron, it's going to bring up issues of pain, the past, and of the need for healing. BML is involved as well, Black Moon Lilith. These mirrored aspects presents eruptive experience as a starting point to address psychological wounds from the past. It's almost as if, looking at this chart, we're seeing signs of dysfunction in both parties, and that they've come together in order, rather riskily, I think, to bring to the surface these hidden themes. Let's move on. Now, what we've done here, the inner wheel is Johnny Depp's tropical birth chart, and the outer wheel is Amber Heard's Draconic. And what we're asking here is, what more specifically is she bringing to his life in terms of a sole purpose? What lessons can be learned? Notice immediately, and I'm almost ignoring my notes here, but Black Moon Lilith, again, that thing that wants to bring things out that are hidden, is sitting on his point, the midheaven. It's quite interesting that it's as if she's there to bring something out that needs to be confronted. And notice also that her Draconic Black Moon Lilith is opposite his tropical Black Moon Lilith, which is very close to the IC, and also opposite her Saturn. That's very interesting indeed. The sole purpose here is, in a sense, to produce an inversion. It's almost to bring the innards out. You could say to some extent there's almost a literal truth if you followed the trial, but certainly in this instance, in both their cases, there seems to be a role to be played in setting off primordial energies which need to be addressed in either one. I'm not going to go delineating what those energies may be at this point, but Scorpio is involved here, Taurus is involved here, so we have stability versus instability. We have that which might be stable as against those forces which represent change, transformation, and hidden themes. As I say in my notes, volatile primordial energies in conflict, she is the wake-up call, no matter the rights and wrongs. She is a wake-up call for him. Whether she's gone about it correctly, whether he's responded correctly to it, that's another issue. But there's a wake-up call here. Saturn is almost midpoint with BML and Neptune, that's also relevant. Heard's Draconic moon shifts to Virgo, conjunct his Virgo, Uranus, Mars, Pluto. This introduces themes of healing potential in this relationship, I think. Her moon is disposited by Mercury in Pisces. So there is believe it or not, even a spiritual dimension to this. It may seem unlikely, yet this chart holds a positive theme as potential. You may say, you see, we can identify the draconic potential, but that doesn't mean that the potential is reached. That is why I say to you, these outcomes cannot be objectively certified, so to speak. We can only suggest them as a plausible way of rationalizing or understanding why the relationship happened in the first place. This chart examines Johnny Depp's draconic purpose in her life. Interestingly, his draconic midheaven is now sitting on all this Capricorn energy. That's very interesting indeed. So there's a raising of profile here. It involves all sorts of different energies. If we go by my notes here, Depp's Uranus, Mars, Pluto in Taurus opposes her Scorpio, Pluto, and is widely conjunct her dignified Venus. There's a high combustibility here that compels inner revolution through relationship. So he too has been put into her life to trigger some kind of revolution. His MC is conjunct Mars and Neptune in Capricorn. A collision of fantasy and reality is one way of putting it, especially with Neptune in Capricorn. Neptune is diffusive, is fantastical in its potential. Capricorn is the structure, is the reality. Somehow there is a need to find a compromise here. And it may very well be that he's a wake-up call to her. That's one way of looking at it. His Saturn is conjunct her Pluto. That's quite problematic. It brings in major control issues between them. It's over here in Scorpio, by the way, so that really does deepen that theme of control issues. It's almost as if both of them are quite willful, both controlling, if I can put it that way, without making any specific allegation. And so, but Pluto tends to act through fear, whereas Saturn is all about what is right, or what is relatively right. And so they have different versions of power, and they need to negotiate that power. In the end, I think they fell foul of their own draconic potential. I'm not sure that, but you never know what effect a relationship may have. Its effects may follow the life through in the years to follow. We cannot sit here and judge a relationship. We can only astrologically identify those energies that we find to be, shall we say, productive of growth. Let's put it like that. And since Draconic is about the higher consciousness, we're also talking about the ideal consciousness. We're talking about the healthy consciousness potential. Notice too that his Draconic Jupiter here is on her Uranus in Sagittarius. That's very interesting. So there is a very expansive potential here. And certainly for a while there was. I mean, she certainly grew through her association with him, but it was all very electric, and well, we know what happened. Really, what's being said here is there's a need for hyper self-awareness, self-control. I don't think in the end they achieved that potential, but this is what the Draconic synastry is suggesting. One legacy of this union may be greater awareness of control issues. No healthy relationship can develop if one party feels entitled at the cost to the other's independence. Now, we move to Oscar Wilde and Bosie. I don't think I need to say too much about them. They certainly were a notorious couple in the 1890s. The relationship really grew as Wilde's career blossomed. He had a fantastically successful time as a playwright from the late 1880s to around the mid-1890s, when he fell foul of the law. As we know, he ended up in jail for gross indecency related to a defamation case he brought against the Marquis of Queensberry, which failed, and then that attracted the attention of state prosecutors, who then charged him with gross indecency. At that time, homosexual acts at that time were illegal. Lord Alfred Douglas was a very spoiled, very capricious, volatile young man, locked in a war with his father. And unfortunately, that row with his father then locked Wilde into a war with the man. And one thing led to another. Now, I've not time to examine their natal charts, so I've gone straight to the tropical synastry. But note certain things. Wild charts is very mutable. It's got some fair fixity. It's quite airy. Bose's chart is certainly more cardinal in its tropical expression. Air is exceptionally high. And I won't say that this is always the case, but I have found that where air is extremely high, there can be empathy problems. It's almost as if he's so aware of his own desires and wants in his head that he's not thinking about other people. And I think that was a feature, certainly of his early life. But even when you follow him into his middle years, he was still a very volatile, capricious individual who could blow up at the slightest thing. And that was part of the problem between him and Wilde. It's interesting, I talked about Black Moon Lilith. Notice that, by the way, we do have time for both of them. And just to clarify, the inner wheel is Oscar Wilde's natal chart. I'm not so sure about his Virgo rising, but we'll have to live with it. He doesn't strike me as a Virgo rising, but we'll go with what is on the Rodden rating for it. And the outer wheel is Lord Alfred Douglas's tropical natal chart. Note, I said to you, Black Moon Lilith tends to arise in significant places. So we notice immediately that Douglas's Black Moon Lilith and Pluto are sitting on the North Node in Wilde's chart. That's quite a destabilizing aspect, intra-aspect. It really does, you know, it's interesting that Wilde wrote his long letter, De Profundis, which means from the depths. Well, from the depths could be a literary version of Pluto and also elements of Black Moon Lilith. It's almost as if it is the part of Alfred Douglas to stir something in his heart or stir something in his soul. And of course, it's opposed by Scorpio energies opposite in the third. What else do I want to notice? Of course, we can see why they were drawn to each other. The two suns down here are quite conjunct in Libra. They were both Librans. You could say about Bosey that he's got a sort of scorpionic element to it. He's on the cusp there, very close to Scorpio. The Marses are out of sign square to each other. Wilde's Jupiter is widely square Bosey's Sun. Bosey's Jupiter is trine Wilde's Sun. In other words, we're talking about excess here, and a feature of their relationship was lots of expensive restaurants, lots of expensive hotels, but also indiscretion. At times together, they seemed to be unaware of the consequences of public displays of affection and so forth, or they're being seen together. This is not a moral judgment, it's just that we have to understand the times. It was a time when homosexuality was widely regarded as a taboo and was illegal. And it's illustrated in the chart only in terms of the risks of excess. Let's look at the Draconic version of the chart. Here it's interesting, notice that the two moons over in the 11th are conjunct in Gemini. So there definitely was a meeting of minds and hearts. There's no question about that. Though in Gemini, it may have had a capricious quality, and certainly one can't say that they married. What you could say is that their association endured over time, but they spent relatively brief times together. What else have we got? Bose's disruptive Uranus is now on Wilde's MC and Saturn. That to me, and that's at the top of the chart, this tells me that it is the part of Alfred Douglas to be the awakener in Wilde's life and to take him on a new journey, which is in Aries. It's very easy in retrospect to say, oh, but it led to disaster and ruin. Well, sometimes we have to experience certain very fundamental and very risky experiences in order to be true to ourselves. And it may be, and it has been argued, that Bosey triggered certain creative energies in Oscar Wilde, while also triggering other energies that weren't so helpful. Notice that this energy is opposed by all this Libra energy in Wilde's chart. There's a need for moderation, which I don't think was really achieved. Notice too that the Jupiter ascendant of Bosie is also sitting on Uranus and Pluto. So this is a very, very eruptive and enlightening relationship. We can't judge it on how things turned out. We have to judge the spiritual character of the relationship. Just to look at my notes, Bosie's Pluto BML is taken to the 7th house. Yeah, okay, well, that's interesting. Wild's Pluto in Pisces opposes Bosie's Saturn in Virgo. Major power themes here, suggestion of intimacy challenges in relationship. Again, it's about power. We saw a variation of that in the debt herd thing. Saturn and Pluto opposing or in a synastry conjunction is quite common, usually with BML quite close. Just to read my notes on the right-hand side, I'm constantly moving my box around. Just forgive me for a moment. Draconically, Bosie opens up a new world to Wild, Uranus in Aries on MC, but faces opposition from Mars on Wild's IC. Note also Bosie's Mars on his IC too in the 10th house. We have a kind of mirror sort of thing going on there with the Mars and IC association. And notice that it is a feature of their Draconic relationship that their families actually in life fought to the end the bond. Marquis of Queensberry fought against it, dragged Wild to court. And in the case of Wild's family, they tried to end the relationship through financial challenges and so forth, but nothing could break them apart. Bosie's Jupiter is on Wild's Pluto in Pisces. That's an inspirational theme, but Pisces can be self-martyring. Remember that. The bond deepened Wild's faith, but through loss. Later in life, Bosie too embraced Christian faith. I do think that there was a spiritually enlightening perspective. There's quite a lot of Pisces energy here. If you look at the 8th house, the transformative area. It's interesting that Wild wrote that wonderful essay, The Soul of Socialism, or something like that. It's gone out of my head what it was, but also in his letter De Profundis, which he wrote to Bosie from jail, he addresses the Christian message. So it's very interesting how both veered towards Christianity at certain points in their life through their various challenges. Wild's Draconic chart is more cardinal. In other words, he's being encouraged in his higher self to take control, to be more honest with himself. And Bosie's chart is a lot more watery. So for him, there was a challenge to develop empathy, to develop a greater sense of the reality of other people. Very briefly here, we're looking at Wild's Draconic effect on Lord Alfred Douglas. So the inner wheel is the tropical chart of Bosie. The outer wheel is the Draconic chart of Wild. It's interesting that Wild's Draconic North Node is taking in Chiron now, and also the moon, obviously the South Node right at the bottom. This is taking in issues within Lord Alfred Douglas. I would suggest one way of interpreting that aspect is releasing him from family restriction. That's how I would interpret that. He's bringing in a new energy. I mean, the family was already dysfunctional, the Queensberrys, but it is the destiny point here causing Bosie to address issues within the self, the harm that's been done through the family and so forth. I mean, taking him in a direction which is entirely new in Aries. I think too that he brought emotional reality to Bosie's world. Notice that Wild's moon is on Bosie's Jupiter in Gemini. Bosie's Saturn in Sagittarius is opposite, isolating and possibly censuring. I'm noticing this here. If you look at Bosie's Draconic moon, it's on, Oscar Wilde's Draconic moon is on Jupiter, which is in itself very encouraging, but there is the Saturn opposition. So there are limits here, restrictions. And do remember that part of the problem was that Bosie brought his father into their relationship through constantly sort of teasing his father in a way with it. You know, it's almost like he was challenging his father to do something about it. I would say, looking at this chart, that Wild was there to challenge Bosie's certain ingrained assumptions about life. perhaps. Wild's Mars in the 4th is on both its Mercury, Venus, Moon in Libra. Note the two suns are exactly sextile, which I think points to a fated bond of some sort. Wild's North Node takes in, as we've noticed, Bose's Chiron opposite Bose's Moon, another indicator of departure from family or restriction. In this chart, we're looking at Oscar Wilde's tropical chart, the inner wheel, and the outer is the Draconic of Bose. Notice that Bose's sun is now it's reasonably conjunct Oscar Wilde's Black Moon Lilith. So once again, we have this need to bring to the surface. And remember, although Bose didn't introduce Wilde to homosexuality, but certainly he gave it its full flourishing as a love. It's interesting too to notice that Bose's Mars is now sitting on Uranus, and that's a pretty volatile combination. It's also opposed by Wilde's Mercury, which takes in Bose's MC. So these are highly challenging aspects. Again, like the Depp Herd, there's almost this need to break things up. It's almost as if it's a creative act to do it. But of course, there will be societal consequences. There's not time to go, you're probably seeing a lot of things. You'll be able to look at this video and then you can study it more for yourself. But certainly the bond inspires the imagination, but faces limits from the outer world. Struggle and pain seem to be the key to enlargement of spirit. And notice over near the descendant point, Bose's Jupiter is sitting on Wilde's Neptune. That's very interesting. This is a very inspirational aspect, but once again, we have the Saturn opposition. So we're up against restrictions, and that is part of their lot of having to deal with limitations and restrictions. We have got a little time just to rush through the third couple. I didn't think we'd get to this point. It's only because I'm speaking as a Gemini very fast. They got married in 1960. It was from the get-go pretty disastrous. She soon got very bored with him and started having extramarital affairs, and he probably was playing away too. Just very quickly about her chart, it's highly cardinal, it's quite willful. She has Aries rising, Uranus rising opposite Venus. So I think we can see problematic there. She's going to be very erratic in relationships. It's going to be pretty electric, but unfortunately, if you don't find some midway between those two energies, then there's going to be a lot of instability. And I think that we can all agree that that is one way of looking at it. Yet that is a nice Venus in Libra. That's a very nice Libra. The sun is dissociate conjunct Neptune. That's interesting. She was known to be quite addictive through smoking and cigarettes and one thing and another, but also to status. And we'll look at that in a moment. In her Draconic chart, which I'm not going to examine, cardinality is missing. So that tells me that her higher soul part is asking her to be less willful, to be more flexible in her approach to life, because mutability is very high in the Draconic chart. We don't have time to show it, take my word for it, and you can look it up for yourself. Setting up a Draconic chart is the simplest thing in the world. All the software programs have Draconic option under chart or zodiac, okay? Whether it's Astro.com, SolarFire, Astro Gold. This is he was originally called Anthony Armstrong Jones. He was a very famous photographer. He then became Lord Snowdon on marriage to the Queen's sister. Highly mutable chart, quite different from Princess Margaret. It's a locomotive, which makes Saturn as the lead planet up in the 11th there. Very, very powerful. So he's got a very ambitious side to him. He's very determined. Neptune is setting, which is appropriate. He was a photographer. North Node has stability themes. In his Draconic chart, cardinality is more emphasized. So he's being encouraged in his higher self to take full control of his life and to assert his reality. And there's the problem. There's the problem in relation to the union between him and Princess Margaret. What we've got here then is the tropical synastry. The outer planet, look at North Node, look at Princess Margaret's BML, Black Moon Lilith on Mars. Wow, that's explosive. Once again, we have this energy that causes the inclination to bring up the primordial energies. Both have Uranus rising. Well, that's a generational thing, but in the rising sense in this, it does point to problems to do with independence. And they were fighting each other constantly about freedom and one thing and another. Her fire, sun, earth, Neptune square, his air. This is very interesting here, down here in the 5th house. Although we're talking about generational outers, but the fact that they're close to her sun and his descendant does, I think, bring in themes to do with fantasy. And her Black Lilith is in the 11th conjunct his Mars and Mercury in Aquarius. Relationship will be intense, highly sexual, marked by jealousy or drama, as was the case. Her air Venus is square his Earth Saturn. That's problematic. His water Venus in 12th square her air Mars. You know, the usual signs of problems in a relationship. This is a highly combustible union, setting the challenge of surviving reality checks and of restraint. Notice if we're going back to all this Virgo and that Leo sun of hers there, opposed by some energy over here, including Black Moon Lilith. Here we're looking at the Draconic synastry now. So we've converted both tropical charts into Draconic versions. Notice now that her Black Moon Lilith is closer to the ascendant point. The shift has personalized it. There is something about his persona or his person that is challenging her fixation with status. It was well known that she clung very much to the baubles of her status. You know, she had to have her vodka and the orange in the morning for breakfast, for the hair of the dog. When she could have married Peter Townsend at some point, and when the Queen said, yeah, you can marry him, but you know, you're going to have to give up your title, you're going to have to live abroad, you won't be on the civil list anymore, you won't get any public money. She said, oh, I'm not doing that. So all her life, she was more royal than the Queen. And I'm wondering whether this association between his ascendant and her Black Moon Lilith is an attempt to disrupt that, because it's sitting opposite all this Neptunian energy now in royal Leo. You see, I know Cancer's involved too, but it's interesting, isn't it? It's all a little bit wide, but I'll allow it. I'm coming towards the end of this talk now, so I can't go into all the things that I wanted to say. But what I will say about this from a Draconic point of view is that one potential purpose of this union is to find independence within it, or to unlearn the self-defeating habit of entering a bond for status or other materialistic reason. If we think about her Neptune shifting to Cancer, sign of emotional responsibility, his Neptune is in proximity, raises the risk of illusory feeling. She started with the fantasy about him, which soon fell away. Another reality about Lord Snowdon is that he was bisexual. So not only did he have relationships with women, but also with men. And that's established. I mean, it's not rumors, it's well known. The overall sole purpose of this relationship is to find emotional authenticity and to understand the damaging power of fantasy or addictive behavior. Remember, Neptune covers in a number of different things. This union raises the risk of addictive behaviors if emotional problems are not faced as realities. Now, I'm coming up towards the end. There was a bit more to be said about their two charts, but I don't know, Wendy, whether you want me to stop.
You still can take another minute or two if you need to, Victor.
Very quickly then, this chart we're looking at is Princess Margaret's tropical inner wheel as against Lord Snowdon's Draconic. So what role is he playing? Interestingly, we now have Venus sitting on her Black Moon Lilith. So it's identifying relationship as being the means to, in a sense, releasing her from her various fixations about status. I know it slipped into Aquarius, which is a liberating sign, relatively speaking, in relation to her Capricorn energy in the tropical. There's a lot more to be said, but notice also that his Black Moon Lilith sitting on her, look at all that, Saturn, MC and Capricorn. He's there to, I mean, I know it's out of sign, but he's there to disrupt her world. In the end, he didn't break her addictions. I don't think she learned anything from the relationship other than to avoid photographers. If we look at what effect she had on his life, I think it's more materialistic. Her Saturn is sitting on his part of fortune in Sagittarius. She elevated him, his status and so forth. We can see down here that he took her in a new direction, but it was a nebulous one in Pisces on her sun. There's a lot more that I could say about this. It's interesting too over here on the setting side that her Draconic Mercury is sitting on his Neptune, and she was pretty inspirational of his work. She opened up his world. There's no question about it. I also notice that her IC is sitting on his moon, but it's also up against, up against MC and Saturn. So we can see here the limitations and the restrictions. But I personally think that this is a much more materialistic chart in relation to lifting him. And I think he was a much more solid figure than she was. And that's not a moral judgment. It's just looking at their Draconics. And that said, I'm sorry it's been a bit fast. I'm sure you're sort of dizzy with it all, and you're probably thinking, gosh, he's jumped a few hurdles there. But I hope that you have heard enough to be interested in approaching Draconic and adding Draconic to your toolkit. And thank you.
Thank you, Victor. That was wonderful. I love that pace. I think it's great. That was
Thank you very much.
It was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Okay. Shall I stop sharing?
Yes, please. And now